Good morning. Hope you're all doing well. Today we're learning Maseches Nedarim Daf Yud Tes, and we're starting at the opening of the Gemara on the bottom of Yud Ches Amud Beis, 7 lines from the bottom. We had just learned the din in our Mishnah, and the previous Mishnah right here on the top of this page, that Stam Nedarim Lahachmir, that if you make a neder, and there's two possible ways to interpret that neder, and we therefore look at it l'chumra. But the Gemara opens with a question on that. How can you say stam nedarim lahachmir? After all, v'hatznan, we have a Mishnah, safek nazirus lahakel, and nazirus is a form of a neder. So which one is it? Amar Reb Zera lo kasha, don't worry, ha Rabbi Eliezer, ha Rabbanan. Where do we see that there's a machlokas Rabbi Eliezer and the Rabbanan in regards to a case of safek? That is found in the following case, Tanya. Hamaktish chayaso vehemto. A person who says, I hereby am maktish my chayos and my behemos. In the process of saying that broad concept, what else did he do? Hiktish es hakoy. He also sanctified an animal, which is called a koi. We've learned about this in Shas many times. A koi is an animal that's a safek chaya, safek behema. So we see that the Tanakama holds that in a case of safek, that you're maktish, that animal. So therefore, that would apply back to our Mishnah, that our Mishnah must be like the Shita of the Rabbanan, because in our Mishnah, Stam Nedarim Lahachmir aligns with this Shita of Hamaktish Chayasu Vehemto Hiktish Es Hakoy. Masha'en Ken Rabbi Eliezer Omer Lo Hiktish Es Hakoy, that animal will not be considered Mukdash because it's a suffix. When there's a suffix, we don't elevate its status. And says the Gemara to articulate the comparison between the Rabbanan and Rabbi Eliezer back to our Mishnah, Manda Amar, according to the one who holds mamono me'ayel l'sveika, that his animal, or his money literally, but his animal will be considered mukdash in regards to a case of safek, gufi nami me'ayel, his body also, namely his naziru status of his own body, that will also become a nazir proper in a case of safek. However, according to Rabbi Eliezer, who says that the animal will not become a koi, his money will not become elevated in a case of safek, so then he would hold gufe, his body in regards to the commitment of nazirus, is kol shekain de lo ayel sveka, all the more so. So this is the Gemara's comparison and answer to our question. It compares the machlokes about a safek, about a koi, which is a safek chaya, safek behema, back to our Mishnah, in regards to whether or not we hold of Stam Nazirus Lahachmir or not. And our Mishnah must be like the Shita of the Rabbanim. And we're on the very top line of Yud Tes Amud Aleph, and the Gemara says, wait 1 second. Amar le Abaye, b'mayu kimta, how did you just establish the Mishnah that in a case of L'safek Nazirus Lahakel, remember our Mishnah was Lahachmir like the Rabbanim, but that also means that Rabbi Eliezer, based on the Mishnah of Koi from the bottom of Yud Ches Amud Beis, that was a case of l'safek lahakil, and that's Rabbi Eliezer. But that's not so simple, because Ema Seifa, at the end of that Mishnah, that we're not our Mishnah, but the Mishnah that we quoted over there by the Koi, we said, in a case of safek bechoros, let's say that a woman and or an animal has twins, boy and girl, but we weren't there to see which animal was born first. We don't know, or which child was born first. If the boy is born first, he has a din of a bechor. If the girl is born first, there is no din of a bechor. So says the Gemara, in a case of safek bechoros, echad bechore adam ve'echad bechore behema. Either way, whether or not we're talking about people, which has a din of bechor as it relates to nachala, or if we're talking about animals, which has its own status of bechor because that's to be brought as a korban, and also bein tmea, bein tahora. Either way, hamotzi mechavero olav haraya. The kohen, who would be the one to collect the bechor items here, it's on him to bring the burden. Now that's not yet our nekuda. Here the Gemara then says, "V'tani Allah ve'asurim begiza be'avoda." These animals, well, at least of course we're talking about animals in this case. If there is an animal that's a safek bechor, we don't know if the boy was born first or the girl. Can you shear the wool? So if it's a bechor, you're not allowed to do giza. But safek bechor, what do? We see from this Mishnah that in a case of safek bechor, it's usher to do the giza, it's usher to shear the animal and to work the animal, and therefore we see that we have a safek in this case lehachmir, and that means that the Mishnah has bifurcated itself, because in the ratio we said it was Rabbi Eliezer who was safek nazirus lehakel, and over here we see that it's safek bechoros lahachmir. So be consistent. Which one is it? Says the Gemara, Amar le, what kind of ridiculous comparison is this? Why is it that you're comparing something where the kedusha is automatic, namely the bechor, to a case of the kedusha hababi de adam, to nazirus, which is only brought about by my being makabel and neder. You're comparing apples and oranges. The seifa of the brisa, which is talking about bechor, has no relevance to the resha. I understand they're both sveikos, but there's a lot of things that are sveikos that you don't compare to one another. And here, these two sveikos are incomparable. The status of a bechor has absolutely nothing to do with anything other than the birthing order of children. The child is the oldest child. He's born a boy. No miscarriages, Peter Rechem, that child is a Bechor. No one's making any Kabbalahs. No one's making any Nedarim. How can you compare that to the world of Nazirus, where the only way that Nazirus comes about is by a person making a Neder? So the Gemara, therefore, rejects our understanding of the Gemara so far. Ela Ikashya, third of the way down, quarter of the way down. Ela Ikashya, Hakashya. If you're going to ask a question, you should have asked this question. We have a din, safek mashkin li tame tame. If you have mashkin, liquids, that there's a safek if they became tame, we assume that they're tame. However, li tame acherim, tahor, divrei Reb Meir. Reb Meir is of the opinion that if you have a liquid and there's a safek as to whether or not that liquid became tame, let's say it's this liquid in the cup, safek about the liquid itself or machmir. What about this liquid having transferred its tumah to something else besafek? No, we stop. We say that safek is too far. And here's the evidence which is really problematic. Rabbi Elazar Omer Kidbarov. Rabbi Eliezer agreed. It says Rabbi Elazar, but the previous Tana that we were comparing to is Rabbi Eliezer. It's L'chora, the Gemara is assuming they're the same person. And that's our question. Says the Gemara, oh, maybe not actually, maybe it's a different Shiloh. Okay, says the Gemara, how can you say that he holds that there's any tame in that tumah status, even of the liquid itself? The Brisa writes, Rebbe Lazar Omer, ein tuma lemashkin kol ikar. That initial liquid that you have a suffix about, there's no tuma kol ikar at all. In this case, when we say kol ikar, what we mean is that there's no tuma midoraisa. That's what it means, that there's no tuma midoraisa. And teda, here's a proof. Sheharei heid Rabbi Yossi ben Yoezer ish tzareda al ayel kamsa. He said, he gave testimony about a kamsa, which is a grasshopper that was referred to as an ayel. And he said, dachan, that it's tahor. Ve'al mashkin beis mitbachaya dachan. And he says as well that the liquids in the beit mitbachaya, which was basically the kitchen area of the Beis HaMikdash, that all of those liquids were tahor. So how can you say...
These are just something else, so that there's okay, it's combinate, but it was more like a pure abundance. So this is no that's involved.
We're going to see a qualification that might be what you're saying, but right now, on its face, the problem is that Rav Meir says that there's a suffix of the liquid itself, it's going to be tamei, but Yossi ben Yoezer ish tzreda says that there's no tuma whatsoever, and those two sources don't match with one another. Those two sources don't match. Correct. So you're already moving toward an explanation. The Gemara says right now, third of the way down, halfway down, Hanicha l'Shmuel, I could understand looking through the lens of Shmuel at this Mishnah, de Amar dachan milatame acherim aval tumas asmo yesh ben shapir. I could understand. Shmuel says, no, don't worry. There is still some tuma in that initial liquid. Again, it might be that Shmuel saying that is derabanan. Elo the Rab de Amar dachan mamish. But according to Rab, that says that liquid is mamish tahor and there's no tuma whatsoever. Michael and Maimar. There's no way you could possibly understand the Shita Rebbe Lazar the right way. And therefore, the Gemara presents its second, and what we will soon see to be is the accepted answer of our Mishnah. Remember what our Mishnah had trouble with? Our Mishnah has trouble with Stam Nedarim Lahachmir, which is the top line of Yud Chesamid Beis, and the first line of the Gemara, which is Stam Nazirus Lahakil. That seems like a stira. Says the Gemara 2/3 of the way down on Yud Chesamid Aleph, Ella Rabbi Yehuda v'Reb Shimon. And let's see how this works out. Titania. Hareini Nazir im yesh b'kri hazeh me'akur. A person throws out a flippant neder nazirus. He looks at this pile and says, if there's 100 kur in that pile, which is units of measure, if there's 100 kur in there, Hareini Nazir, I'm going to be a Nazir. V'halach, and he went there. Umitzau shenignav o she'avad. They looked on the Nest camera and they saw that someone walked away with a massive amount of food. But we don't know what the initial amount was. We can only measure what we have. So maybe it was, we really don't know. It's a pure suffix. Were there mea kri? Were there, what was the measure? Was there, yeah, it was a mea kur. It says the Gemara, were there mea kur in that kri? So suffix, here's our machlokas. Rabbi Yehuda says matir. He says that's not considered nazirus. Safek Nazirus Lahakel, like at the beginning of our Gemara. The Reb Shimon Oser, Reb Shimon says, no, we have a Safek in regards to the Doraisa status of your neder of Nazirus. That's our Mishnah on the top of Yud Chesamid Beis, Stam Nedarim Lahachmir. Very, very, very clean machlokas. It's really not it's machlokas, it's not a stira. We just have different shitas. So our Mishnah was clearly authored by the shita of Reb Shimon, who's Oser. That's why our Mishnah says Stam Nedarim Lahachmir. And the Gemara's opening question was really a flawed question. It's not a stira to our Mishnah. You just don't know what you're talking about. And really, that's the shita of Rabbi Yehuda. And that really does end this part of the question of the Gemara. So we've asked and answered one question of the Gemara. And now the Gemara, within the answer that we just gave, has a problem. We have a stira from Rabbi Yehuda onto Rabbi Yehuda. What did Rabbi Yehuda just teach us? Safek Nazirus lahakel. We weren't sure if there were 100 kur in the kri when he made his commitment, because now it's been stolen. We don't know what the initial numbers were. And he said, don't worry, Matir, he was Mekil. However, at the same time, Mi Amar Rabbi Yehuda, Lo Ma'ayel Inisha Nafshe L'Sveika. Would we in fact say that when a person themselves is in Safek, that they wouldn't put themselves into the more Machmir category? Uraminhi, Rabbi Yehuda Omer, we saw this in our Mishnah. We saw this in our Mishnah that we learned on Shabbos. Stam Truma Bi Yehuda Asura Ubegalil Muteris. When we talk about Truma in Yehuda, you're right, we're probably talking about Truma Salishka, a language familiar to them like we saw in our Mishnah. And therefore, if you say Truma Stam, remember what our Mishnah was talking about. If you're loose with your words, so then we're going to be Machmir, we're going to say the Neder's going to work because you're likely talking about Truma Salishka. However, Begalil Muteres, why in the Galil, if you said the word Harei Alai Truma, would your Neder not count? Because She'ein Anshe HaGalil Makir as Truma Salishka, because they've never heard of Truma Salishka. Says the Gemara, makes a diuk. Taima de ein makirin. The only reason why it's true that they were not going to be considered a neder in that case was because they weren't familiar. But hamakirin, had it been that they knew downtown in that other city what was going on, they knew about Trumas Alishka, hamakirin asurin. So that means that really Stam Nedarim Lahachmir against Rabbi Yehuda himself. We just said Rabbi Yehuda is the answer to our Gemara. Our Gemara started with Stam Nazirus Lahakil. Stam Nazirus Lahakil must be Rabbi Yehuda. Our Mishnah is not Rabbi Yehuda, it's Rabbi Shimon. Rabbi Yehuda, you're Lahakil. Over here we see that you're Lahachmir based on the diuk from our Mishnah. Amar Rava, hold on one second. Beautiful, beautiful subtleties in the Gemara here. Amar Rava, top line of Yud Testament Beis. Amar Rava, Gabe Kri, in regards to the case of the Kri, the man walks over and says, if there's 100 kur in this Kri, hereby I'm a Nazir. Kasavar, Koshes Sveiko Chamor Mivadai, when you have a case of Suffolk, that because it's a Suffolk is therefore more stringent than had you actually been a Nazir, when the suffix is worse than the vadai, lo ma'ayel nafshe l'sveika, then we're not going to say it's a suffix. How does this pan out? Says the Gemara, dilugabe nazir vadai, when a person is definitely a nazir, megaleach umevi korban v'nechal, he shaves, gets a haircut, and then he brings korbanos. But al sveiko, he's not allowed to do that. Lo mati megalech, nor can he bring the korbanos. Remember, it's havas chulin la'azara. If you're not a Nazir, you can't bring Korbanos Stam. If you're a Safek Nazir, the Safek of Nazirus is more Machmir than the Vadai of Nazirus, because you can't bring Korbanos. So therefore, that's why the Gemara says that no, it's not a stira within Rav Huna. Rav Huna had to be Mekel in regards to a case of Safek Nazir, but he's allowed. He can be Machmir in a case of Safek Nazir, so it's not a stira at all. Amalei Rav Huna bar Yehuda, the Rava. Amar Hareini Nazir La'olam Mai. Your argument is not a good argument because I can come up with a scenario where you can never shave. What is that? That's a case where it's Hareini Nazir La'olam. Nazir Olam, he never gets to shave. Amar Le Nazir Olam Nami Sveiko Chamar Mibadai. Still, in the case of Nazir Olam, the suffix is still worse than the Vadai. Why? The ilu Vadai, in regards to the case of a person who's a Vadai Nazir La'olam, Hich Bitsaro Mekil Bitsaaru maybe Shalosh Behemos. Even in a case where a person is a Nazir La'olam, if his hair gets to be so burdensome, he's allowed to trim the hair, and then he just brings 3 korbanos and continues his Nazirus. There is an out. But if you're a Safek, you're not allowed to do that, only if you're a Vadai. So that's what the Gemara says. He's not allowed. Says the Gemara, fine. Let me pivot one more time for you. Amar Hareini Nazir Shimshon Mai. What about Nazir Shimshon, which is no haircut forever? Even if hichbid saro, even if your hair gets very long, says the Gemara, Amar Le, Nazir Shimshon lo tanya. Just not, you're right, but that's not what we were talking about. We were either talking about a case of Stam Nazirus or Nazir Olam, but not Nazir Shimshon. Says the Gemara, Amar Le, Amar Ravada bar Ava tanya Nazir Shimshon. Wait 1 second. We have a brisa that says explicitly we're talking about Nazir Shimshon. Amarle Tanya Tanya. If you have a shita that has a brisa like that, congratulations. That's not how I learned. It's not. That's not what's going on here. So there's seemingly a subtle machlokes. Maybe there's two ways to understand this Gemara, but maybe there's a machlokes in regards to whether or not we're including a case of Nazir Shimshon. All of that was answer number one in regards to Reb Yehuda's stira, the kasha Reb Yehuda ad Reb Yehuda. And here's the second one. We'll be going to the last word on the page, last line. That's where we'll be stopping for today. And the Gemara gives our second answer. Rav Ashi Omar, Hahi Reb Yehuda Mishum Rebbe Tarfon. One of the shitas that we saw Reb Yehuda isn't really Reb Yehuda's shita. It's just Reb Yehuda quoting Rebbe Tarfon. What's the case? Titania, halfway down. Reb Yehuda Omer. Mishum Rabbi Yehuda Mishum Rabbi Tarfon Omer Ein Echad Mehen Nazir Lefi Shelo Nitna Nazirus Elo Lehafla. What was going on in this case? So let's say you and I were sitting on the porch together. We look out at people walking in our direction, and I say, if that guy is a Nazir, then I'm a Nazir. And you say, if that guy isn't a Nazir, then I'm a Nazir. Right? Very loose. Like there's no. They're like if equations instead of definite equations. And we saw this idea. When a person is accepting upon themselves nazirus, it has to be behafla. What was our case? If there are 100 kur in the kri, stop. That's not hafla. That's not clear. That's not articulate. That's not happening. That's not nazirus. So that's why we said that. Says Gemara, ihachi. If it's true that it's Rabbi Tarfon, and really there's just no hafla, my irya shenigna v'shenevad. Why did you create the case of the kur might have had some food removed from it? Who cares? Even if no food was removed from it, if you walk over to the kri and say, if there's 100 kri in there, then I'm going to be a nazir. And if there's 99, then I won't be. That's not hafla either. That's the same thing as the case of Rabbi Tarfon. If Chaim is a nazir, then I'm a nazir. If Shmuel is not a nazir, then I'm not a nazir. Says the Gemara, then why the case? Says the Gemara, I can answer that. I can tell you exactly why we spoke about the case of Nignav Nevad. And the Gemara responds 2/3 of the way down. We're being overly detailed in our case and saying that maybe even some might have been lost or stolen in order to elevate and explain the sheet of Reb Shimon. The afal gav the nignav oshe avad. Even though in the case of the kri, he says in that kri, if there's 100 kur, I may be a nazir. Kasava, Reb Shimon still holds, and this is completely mechudash. Me'ayil inish nafshe l'safek. L'sveiko. That's incredible. Same. But it's not the case he was talking. He was talking about our case. Correct. L'chora. That's what it seems. I mean, unless you can distinguish between the cases. The case that's for sure is the case of 100 kur. So how does he answer hafla? That's a question too. Maybe that is hafla for him. He still has to factor in hafla. But he says that the reason why our case spoke about Nignav Nevad wasn't because of Rabbi Yehuda, because Rabbi Yehuda doesn't care if it's Nignav Nevad, because it's not enough hafla. But Rabbi Shimon says, no, whatever his answer is by hafla, doesn't matter over here. I'm saying that even Nignav Nevad, that's a chiddush, because I'm going to tell you that afal pikain, you're still considered a nazir. Last little sugya for the day. Perfect timing. Rabbi Yehuda Omer, Stam Truma bi Yehuda. We had said in our mission the case of Stam Truma. So let's make some inferences. We said Stam Truma bi Yehuda's aser because in Yehuda, where the Beis Hamikdash was, people were used to talking about the money of the Truma Salishka. So what was the word association of Truma? Truma is Truma Salishka. Word associations, that's Davar HaNadur. And therefore, if they say Harei Alai Truma, Stam, we assume they're talking about the Lishka, which is Davar HaNadur, and then their neder is binding. Hamakirin, but in the Galil, where that wasn't the language, we said that their stam didn't mean that, and it wasn't binding. But Hamakirin, if in the Galil, they did know that Truma was an association to Truma Salishka, then it would have been Asurin. Alma, what can we infer from this part of our Mishnah? Sveika lechumra, that when a person is stam, even in the Galil, where Truma doesn't always mean Truma Salishka, but only sometimes does, but still, if they did know about it, and we're Safek, we don't know what your intentions were, we're Machmir, Asurin. But a Maseifa, that inference of that line doesn't work with the final line of the Mishnah. What was the case of the Seifa? We said Stam Charamim bi Yehuda Mutarin. In Yehuda, Charamim were assumed to be that of Kohanim. And because in Yehuda, we knew that Charamim went to Kohanim, therefore, that's Davar HaAsur, not Davar HaNadur, and therefore it's not binding, therefore Mutarin. And then we said in our Mishnah of the Galil Asurin, in the Galil, where they had charamim for things other than Kohanim, they had consecrations to the Beis Hamikdash for other things as well. In that case, says the Gemara, it was Asurin. Why? Because they're not thinking the same way. They're not used to consecrations to Kohanim because they don't live in the Beis Hamikdash neighborhood. They live in a different area. They live in the Galil. What's the inference from here? But had they known, Hamakirin, had it been that in the Galil, they knew that really charamim, that consecrations could also be made to Kohanim, which is a davar ha'asur, not a davar ha'nadr, then mutarim. Then their safek would not have been abiding there. Their alma, what do we see from here? Sfeika lekula. So we have, within the end of our Mishnah, a very gentle machlokes, contradiction, internal contradiction with the inferences of each line. So if you look back at our Mishnah that we learned on Shabbos, at the end of the Mishnah on Yud Ches Amid Beis, and the last 5 lines there, we saw this sheet of Rabbi Yehuda. Stam Truma Yehuda Sur Begal Mutarm. Why? Because they don't recognize it. So those 2 lines don't fit. One of that, they look like they're both Rabbi Yehuda. Rabbi Yehuda Omer, Stam Truma this and Stam Truma that. And then he says, but by Charamim it's different. Charam Yehuda Mutarim. But the problem is that those 2 lines, the suffix in regards to the case of Truma and the suffix in regards to the case of Charamim, their inferences are opposite. So the Gemara responds 4 lines from the bottom of Yud Testament Beis, and we'll close with this answer. Amar Abaye, Seifa, the very last line of our Mishnah wasn't Rabbi Yehuda. It does say Rabbi Yehuda Omer, but Rabbi Yehuda Omer was only talking about the case of suffix in regards to Harei Alai Truma. There we say it's like him, but in the case of Harei Alai Charamim, that wasn't Rabbi Yehuda. That was Rabbi Lazar Reb Sadoki, Titania. Rabbi Yehuda Omer, Stam Truma Yehuda Asura, and here's the distinction. Rabbi Lazar Reb Sadok Omer Stam Charamim Begal Asurin. It has to be that way because the inferences of each line are opposite. Rabbi Yehuda's inference would be lechumra, and Rabbi Yoezer's would be lekula. And is that right? Did I get that backwards? Yeah, that's correct. And therefore, we have to say that really our Mishnah is either missing language or it was assumed that last a couple of lines of the Mishnah in Yud Ches Amud Beis, where it says the case of Charamim, and the case says Stam Charamim, it's 3 lines before the end of the Mishnah, 2 lines. Stam Charamim Yehuda Mutar, and that line is not Rabbi Yehuda. There we need to really, again, I don't know if we actually add it, but it should say Rabbi Lazar, Rabbi Sadok Omer. That's what we're talking about. It has to be that way because the inferences otherwise don't align. Correct. But we wouldn't have, the Art Scroll did that. I mean, I didn't see that until you said it, but Art Scroll did that, foreshadowing what we're going to see. Correct. But really, the Kasal Kadaitach should have been that they were the same author because there was 0 distinction. Yeah. Workflow. I don't know. If I were writing the Art Scroll, I wouldn't have done that because like you're cheating. You're cheating. You're giving the answer. You're showing your cards. That's right. Yeah, Mefarish, yeah. In our Mishnah? Oh, no, sometimes he'll say, we'll explain in the Gemara what this means, but it depends. All right, again, we're not in person Monday, we're not in person Tuesday, we're back in person Wednesday, and I'll post recordings for tomorrow's shiur and for Tuesday's shiur. Wishing you all a beautiful couple of days.